Jack Lawson was a solitary figure in the heart of rural Texas. At 78 years old, he had lived through decades of hard labor and quiet reflection. His weathered hands, callous from years of work, told the story of a man who had spent his life building and maintaining, never seeking recognition. His eyes, though aged, held a quiet wisdom, reflecting a life lived with purpose but without fanfare. In the small town where he resided, Jack was known as Old Jack, a fixture in the community who kept to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, but he had learned long ago the value of silence and minimal conversation. He would nod respectfully when passing others on the road, but he never lingered to exchange pleasantries. Jack's most notable possession was his old 1962 Chevy pickup truck, a relic from another time. The faded blue paint and cracked leather seats had earned the truck a place in local legend. Children in the town had affectionately dubbed it the War Wagon, its battle scars and antique design making it a symbol of endurance. But no one truly understood the depth of its history or the significance it held for Jack. For almost 6 decades, the truck had been Jack's only companion, carrying him through every season of his life. The truck had seen everything, good times and bad, and it had been with him through it all. Every Tuesday and Friday, Jack would drive it into town to buy his sparse necessities, always paying with exact change, always with minimal conversation. There was a routine to his life, a quiet rhythm that the locals respected, even if they didn't fully understand. Yet, on this particular Tuesday evening, something was different. Jack was preparing for something unusual, something that would break the long-standing pattern he had followed for nearly 60 years. He wasn't just driving his truck for his usual errands. This time, he was about to embark on a journey that would change his life, and the lives of those around him, forever. Jack's routine and unusual preparation. For nearly 6 decades, Jack Lawson's life had followed a set, predictable pattern. Every Tuesday and Friday, without fail, he would drive his old Chevy truck into town, his weathered hands gripping the worn steering wheel as the engine hummed steadily beneath him. The trips were simple and methodical. Jack wasn't one for small talk or excess. He bought only the bare necessities, canned goods, fresh bread, and other staples, nothing more. His transactions were quick, paying with exact change and never exchanging more than a few words with the cashier. The locals knew him as the quiet, solitary man who kept to himself, his routines as much a part of the town as the old oak tree on Main Street or the courthouse clock tower. But on this particular Tuesday evening, something changed. Jack's movements inside his modest home were different. There was an unusual intensity to the way he went about his tasks. He carefully closed the door to the small, cluttered room where he kept his most treasured possessions, setting the rest of the house in stillness. In the corner of the room sat a small wooden table, upon which Jack laid a small object, his hands slow but deliberate as he unwrapped it from soft cloth. His fingers, now stiff with age, trembled slightly, but there was a certain reverence in his touch. He placed the object in an old, hand-carved wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. The box, like so much of Jack's life, held secrets. It was sealed with a simple brass lock, and next to it, he placed a carefully written letter, its inked cursive revealing a slight tremor in his right hand, a sign of the passing years. The letter was addressed plainly, Precinct 12 Police Department. Jack stared at the box for a long moment, his mind far away. Then, with a deep sigh, he placed both the letter and the box on the passenger seat of his truck. The old engine groaned to life as he turned the key, the familiar sound filling the air around him. Tonight, Jack wasn't just following his usual route to town. Tonight, he had a mission, one that had been decades in the making, one that only he could fulfill. And as the truck rattled down the road toward the county seat, Jack couldn't help but wonder if tonight would mark the end of a long journey he had set in motion all those years ago. The unexpected checkpoint. As Jack Lawson's truck rumbled along the dark, quiet highway, the vast Texas sky stretching above him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. It wasn't just the weight of the mission he was carrying in the passenger seat beside him, but the strange stillness that had settled over the road. The familiar hum of the engine, the rhythmic thump of the tires against the asphalt, was usually a comforting sound. But tonight there was something off, something unfamiliar. Jack had driven this stretch of road countless times, but never before had he encountered what lay ahead. When he reached the county line, his heart skipped a beat. The flashing lights of a police checkpoint suddenly appeared on the horizon, cutting through the night like a warning. It was an odd sight for this stretch of road, typically devoid of such attention. Jack had never been stopped here before. He had lived in this area his entire life, known by every officer in the county, and yet tonight, of all nights, he was being flagged down. A young officer, barely more than 25 years old, waved his flashlight at Jack's truck. The officer was dressed in standard patrol gear, his face framed by the harsh glow of the checkpoint lights. Jack brought the truck to a slow stop, the engine's rumble fading into the night as the officer approached. "License and registration, please," the officer called out, his voice carrying a hint of authority but not the kind that would demand immediate respect. Jack could sense the officer's nervousness, a rookie trying to prove himself. Jack complied without protest, reaching into his worn coat pocket and retrieving a wallet that looked as aged as everything else in his life. When the officer flashed his flashlight into the cab of the truck, Jack's eyes briefly met his. There was no fear in Jack's gaze, only the calm of someone who had seen far worse in his life. He handed over the faded driver's license, the photo barely recognizable after all these years. The officer examined it carefully, then glanced back up at Jack. "What brings you out here so late, Mr. Lawson?" the officer asked, his tone now tinged with suspicion. "Police business," Jack replied, his voice gravelly, shaped by decades of disuse. It was a simple answer, but one that seemed to make the officer uneasy. The officer hesitated, his brow furrowing. There was a momentary silence before he asked the next question. "Mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" Jack's hand instinctively moved towards the passenger seat, toward the wooden box. His fingers wrapped around it protectively, as if the box was the last piece of a puzzle he'd spent a lifetime trying to complete. "What's in my truck isn't for curious eyes, son," Jack said firmly, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "It's for Precinct 12, and only Precinct 12. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, unsure how to respond. The air between them crackled with tension, and Jack could see the shift in the officer's demeanor, his suspicion growing, his training kicking in. The officer's words became sharper. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to check the contents of your truck." Jack's eyes never wavered. He knew what was coming, but he also knew what he had to protect. "I can't let you do that," he said calmly. "This isn't ordinary cargo." As the officer called for backup, the weight of the situation settled into Jack's chest. He wasn't just an old man in a beat-up truck anymore. His refusal to comply was no longer about an ordinary traffic stop. It was about the promise he had kept for nearly 50 years, a promise that tonight, finally, needed to be fulfilled. The police confrontation. The air grew thick with tension as two more patrol cars arrived at the scene, their lights flashing in the still night. Jack Lawson, who had always been seen as an unremarkable old man, now found himself surrounded by a growing number of officers. The young rookie officer, whose hand had wavered near his holster, now stood more confidently, as if bolstered by the backup that had arrived. Jack's truck, once a symbol of simplicity and quiet routine, now appeared out of place, a relic under the spotlight of suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle, sir!" The rookie officer barked again, his voice now firm, demanding compliance. Jack remained seated, his hands resting gently on his knees, his eyes meeting those of the officers around him. He wasn't intimidated. He knew what this was about, and he wasn't about to compromise a promise that had been decades in the making. His hand never left the wooden box on the passenger seat, the weight of it a constant reminder of what was at stake. "Last chance, sir," another officer called out, this one standing to Jack's side, his posture more aggressive. "Exit the vehicle and consent to a search, or we'll have to detain you." The officer's hand rested on his baton now, ready for escalation. Jack's voice remained calm, almost detached, as if he were simply discussing the weather. "I believe you're making a mistake," he said quietly, his tone unwavering. "But I won't resist." The young officer's face tightened with frustration, his command crumbling under the weight of the situation. "Get him out of the truck!" he shouted, and without waiting for a response, the officers moved toward Jack. As the officers reached for him, Jack made no attempt to fight back, but his gaze hardened. His thoughts were not on the handcuffs they were about to place on his wrists, nor on the physical discomfort that might follow. They were on the wooden box, his duty to protect it at all costs. A promise, made long ago, now weighed heavier than his own freedom. In the distance, the officers' voices faded as they moved Jack from his truck to the back of one of the patrol cars. His mind was elsewhere, not on his current predicament, but on the promise to his fallen comrades, the long-buried truth that he carried in the worn box beside him. At the station, things moved quickly. Jack was processed through the system with chilling efficiency. His fingerprints were taken, a procedure so routine that the officers barely paid attention to the frailty of his hands. But something about Jack's fingerprints triggered a strange reaction in the system, a peculiar alert that piqued the curiosity of the booking officer. Meanwhile, in the small holding area, Jack sat in silence, his posture straight despite the handcuffs that constrained him. He showed no sign of fear, only quiet patience. He had been through much worse in his life. This was nothing compared to the horrors he had seen in the past. But something about the calm dignity with which he sat seemed to unsettle those around him, making them question whether they were dealing with an ordinary old man or someone far more significant than they could understand. Outside, the buzz of station activity continued, but in Jack's mind, only the promise he had kept for nearly 50 years remained. What happened next was out of his hands. It would take someone far beyond these small-town officers to understand the true weight of his mission. Walter's calm response and detainment. The metal click of Jack's handcuffs echoed in the cold air, signaling the escalation of the situation. But Jack, despite being surrounded by officers, remained still, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His thoughts were far from the immediate danger of the handcuffs or the officers' demands. He had spent the better part of his life preparing for this very moment, a promise to his fallen comrades that had carried him through decades of silence and solitude. As the officers escorted him into the precinct, Jack's calm composure stood in stark contrast to the flurry of activity around him. His steady gaze met the curious eyes of the officers processing him. Jack knew they saw only an elderly man in handcuffs, someone they could dismiss as just another criminal. But to Jack, the weight of the wooden box in the passenger seat of his truck far outweighed any of the officers' fleeting judgments. The booking officer, a young man with a mix of indifference and duty on his face, quickly took Jack's fingerprints. Jack watched as the officer moved methodically, his actions mechanical, unaware of the strange significance his fingerprints were about to trigger. When the officer ran Jack's information through the system, something unexpected occurred. A specialized security flag appeared, something that the officer had never seen before. It wasn't a criminal record, but something far more peculiar, something out of place in the routine processing of a man like Jack. The officer briefly mentioned the anomaly to his supervisor, who simply shrugged it off. "Continue with standard procedures," the supervisor instructed, clearly uninterested in the matter. But as the supervisor returned to his desk, his eyes lingered on the screen for a moment longer, a quiet curiosity brewing in his mind. Meanwhile, Jack sat in the stark holding area, his hands resting calmly on his knees, his back straight. His eyes were focused, not on the bustle of the station around him, but somewhere far beyond it, perhaps on the decades he had spent waiting for this very moment to come. He had never been a man to express his emotions freely, but the solemnity of the moment weighed heavily on him. Every second he spent in this holding area was a reminder of the promise he had made, to return the insignia that had been entrusted to him, to make sure those who had died were not forgotten. Captain Kate Reynolds, who had been observing the situation from behind the glass partition of her office, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't a typical case. The old man they had detained wasn't acting like someone who had just committed a crime. His demeanor was too calm, too composed, his eyes too clear for someone who had just been arrested. In all her years of law enforcement, Reynolds had learned to spot certain behaviors: fear, nervousness, or guilt, but she saw none of them in Jack. What she saw was a man who had lived through something far greater than any of them could understand. "Who called this in?" Captain Reynolds asked, her voice sharp as she turned to the desk sergeant. "Checkpoints at the county line, ma'am," the sergeant replied. "They said he was acting suspicious, refused a vehicle search, and claimed he had police business, but wouldn't elaborate." Reynolds leaned back in her chair, considering the report. She studied Jack's posture, the way his hands rested precisely on his knees, his back perfectly straight despite the handcuffs. There was a military precision in the way he sat, something that caught her off guard. "Get me a full background check on this man. Something doesn't add up," Reynolds ordered, her instincts kicking in. She knew that there was more to this elderly man than he was letting on. Something about him felt different. She had seen enough in her career to know when there was a story buried beneath the surface. Across the station, Officer Rachel Tanner and her partner, Derek Collins, had just begun examining the contents of Jack's truck, including the box he had been so protective of. As they carefully removed the box from the vehicle, both officers could tell it was something extraordinary. The craftsmanship of the hand-carved wood, the age of the box, and the fine detailing on the lock all pointed to something far more valuable than a simple piece of personal property. They carefully opened the box, their hands gloved to prevent contaminating whatever lay inside. When the lid clicked open, both officers froze. Inside, nestled in the velvet lining, was a military insignia unlike any they had ever seen. Its design was intricate, its surface marked with encrypted serial numbers and a specialized unit emblem that didn't match anything in their training. It wasn't just an old military decoration, it was something far more significant, something that screamed of hidden history. "Rachel," Derek whispered, his voice tinged with awe. "This looks military, but it's different. Look at the detail on this. And these numbers." Rachel nodded, her gaze narrowing as she studied the insignia. "We need to report this," she said, her voice low. "This isn't just some old war trinket. This is something big." But before they could make further sense of what they had found, Tanner noticed something else, a set of barely visible markings on the bottom edge of the box. Something had been stamped there, then intentionally sanded down. The markings were too deliberate to be a coincidence. "We need to run this through the system," Rachel said urgently, her fingers already reaching for her radio. Whatever was in this box was about to change everything. A strange discovery. As Officer Tanner and his partner, Derek Collins, continued to examine the contents of Jack Lawson's truck, a growing sense of unease settled over the precinct. What had started as a routine arrest of an elderly man was quickly evolving into something far more mysterious, and every new detail seemed to add more weight to the situation. Tanner carefully placed the intricately carved wooden box on the evidence table, her hands steady despite the growing tension in the air. "I've never seen anything like this," Derek said, his voice filled with awe as he studied the insignia inside the box. The emblem was not one commonly seen in military circles. It was beautifully crafted, with fine details that spoke of a high rank and specialized purpose. The markings around the edges were cryptic, encrypted serial numbers that made no immediate sense to either officer. Neither of them had ever encountered anything quite like it during their training. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she gently turned the insignia over, inspecting every angle. The more she looked at it, the more she felt that it was something significant, far beyond the ordinary collectibles or war trophies that sometimes found their way into evidence rooms. This felt important. The object felt like it was a part of a larger story, one that had been buried for years. Derek, too, was growing increasingly intrigued by the object's mystery. He motioned to Rachel, indicating the markings on the bottom of the box. The design was subtle, almost imperceptible at first glance, but it was unmistakable once pointed out. A set of numbers and symbols had been meticulously stamped into the wood, then sanded down carefully to obscure them. This was no accident. Whatever had been on this box was deliberately erased, but not thoroughly enough. "These aren't just decorative," Rachel said quietly. "This box, this insignia, it's not just a relic. This could be classified material." Derek looked at her, concern creeping into his voice. You think it's military grade? More than that, Rachel responded, her voice tinged with apprehension. This could be something far bigger than just an old soldier's keepsake. We need to get this checked out immediately. She motioned for Derek to take photos of the insignia from multiple angles while she carefully opened the letter that had been tucked alongside it in the box. The letter was written in an elegant, flowing cursive, but the handwriting showed signs of age, a slight tremor in the strokes that revealed the writer's years. Rachel held it up under the harsh light of the evidence room, reading the contents carefully. To Precinct 12, this is the original insignia of Echo Alpha Unit, retrieved from Fire Base Horizon, Vietnam, 1975. It must be returned to the rightful military authorities upon confirmation of Protocol Silver Line. May those who fell be remembered. May those who wait find peace. Signed, Colonel Jonathan Lawson. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the letter aloud. The name struck her like a lightning bolt. Lawson. The same last name as the elderly man they had just arrested, Jack Lawson. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Rachel, Derek said, his voice low with disbelief. This letter's signed by Colonel Jonathan Lawson. This is his father, right? Rachel nodded, her mind racing as the implications hit her. Echo Alpha Unit. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about covert military operations during the fall of Saigon, but nothing concrete had ever been confirmed. Echo Alpha was one of the most classified military units in history, an operation that was thought to have disappeared into the shadows of time, buried with the memories of those who had served in it. Jack Lawson isn't just some old man, Rachel muttered to herself. He's tied to a piece of history, an operation so secretive, we've only heard rumors about it. Derek, who had been scanning the letter for any further clues, looked up at Rachel, his face pale. We need to report this. Now. Before Rachel could respond, her radio crackled to life. Officer Tanner Collins, report to Captain Reynolds' office immediately. Rachel exchanged a look with Derek before grabbing the letter and insignia. Whatever had just been discovered was much bigger than anything they could handle alone. The gravity of the situation was settling in. They were no longer dealing with a simple arrest. They were holding something that could change the course of history, and the mystery of Jack Lawson was only just beginning to unravel. The military's arrival. As the quiet hum of the police station continued, the officers present felt an unsettling shift in the air. The discovery of Jack Lawson's insignia and the letter detailing his connection to Echo Alpha Unit had sparked more than just curiosity. It had ignited a firestorm of activity behind the scenes. Captain Kate Reynolds, who had been monitoring the unfolding situation from her office, felt the weight of the moment. Something about Jack Lawson, this quiet, unassuming man, had set off alarm bells that reverberated through the station. Just as Captain Reynolds was about to call for a full briefing on the situation, a sudden change in the atmosphere outside caught everyone's attention. The soft murmur of conversations and the rustling of papers in the station came to an abrupt halt. Officers in the bullpen stood frozen, their eyes flicking toward the windows. Without warning, the front doors of the station were thrown open, and a dark convoy of military SUVs rolled into the parking lot. 6 black SUVs, each marked with military insignia, moved in perfect formation. The vehicles were eerily silent, no sirens blaring, no flashing lights warning of their arrival. They moved with practiced precision, the kind of discipline that spoke of something far beyond a routine operation. The officers standing by the front entrance exchanged nervous glances, the quiet buzz of tension growing louder by the second. This wasn't a typical military presence. This was something far more significant. The headlights of the SUVs flicked off simultaneously, plunging the scene into near darkness. Only the exterior lights of the station illuminated the parking lot, casting long shadows across the vehicles. The precision of their movements was unsettling, and the atmosphere inside the precinct grew heavier. Every officer could feel it, the sense that something monumental was unfolding. A small group of military personnel began to emerge from the vehicles, each moving with calculated purpose. There was no chatter, no unnecessary words exchanged. These individuals knew exactly what they were doing, and every step they took seemed coordinated, like a well-oiled machine. The air around them felt charged with authority, and it was clear that this wasn't a typical military presence. It was a special, high-level operation. Within minutes, the parking lot had been sealed off. The military personnel took positions, securing all entrances and exits. Officers from the precinct stood frozen, unsure of what to do, as they watched the swift, disciplined movements of the military men and women. Inside the station, the dispatcher attempted to reach the officers on the security channels, but the response was terse and almost cold. Secure channel established. Stand by for senior officer. Something's happening, whispered one of the younger officers, his voice shaky. Is this some kind of training exercise? A seasoned sergeant, his face grim, shook his head slowly. No training exercise I've ever seen. Those are Joint Special Operations insignias. This is bigger than us. The doors to the front desk opened, and 3 figures walked in with the same military precision. 2 military police officers flanked a third man, who was dressed in the uniform of a 3-star general. His posture was immaculate, every movement radiating authority. His presence alone silenced the station as he moved past the officers, his gaze fixed ahead. The general's voice, commanding and deep, rang out across the room as he addressed the desk sergeant. I need to speak with Captain Reynolds. Immediately. We're here for a detainee. His words were simple, but the weight of them hung in the air. The sergeant, stunned by the sudden arrival of the general, nodded quickly and gestured toward Captain Reynolds' office. Yes, sir. Right away. As the general passed through the station, officers stood at attention, their eyes fixed on him as he walked past them with the military police by his side. His every movement was measured, deliberate. His gaze briefly passed over the holding area where Jack Lawson was sitting quietly, and for a split second, Jack's eyes met his. There was no fear, no hesitation in Jack's gaze, just the same calm, resolute focus he had shown all his life. When the general entered Captain Reynolds' office, he wasted no time. His sharp eyes flicked to the desk where the evidence lay, the insignia, the letter, and the wooden box. Without asking, he immediately recognized the significance of what had been discovered. Captain Reynolds, the general began, his voice steady. I understand you've detained Commander Jack Lawson. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the weight of the name seemed to settle heavily in the room. Reynolds stiffened, now realizing the gravity of the situation. She hadn't fully understood who Jack Lawson truly was, but the general's words left no room for doubt. She had just arrested one of the most decorated covert operators in American military history. Please, the general continued, take me to him. We need to speak. The realization and military involvement. Captain Reynolds stood frozen for a moment, the full weight of the situation sinking in. She had assumed Jack Lawson was just another elderly man with a mysterious background, an old soldier perhaps, a relic from the past, nothing more. But now, with the general's words hanging in the air, she understood that Jack was much more than that. The term commander had cut through the fog of uncertainty like a knife. Commander Jack Lawson, Reynolds whispered under her breath, her mind racing. The man she had just detained wasn't just a suspect. He was someone of extraordinary significance, someone with a history tied to covert operations so sensitive that the military had mobilized its top-level assets to secure him. The realization was staggering, and a ripple of unease spread through her. Sir, Reynolds said, forcing herself to remain composed. I didn't realize who he was. I thought. The general cut her off, his expression hardening. You didn't know. But now you do. And now, we need to move quickly. He stepped forward, his boots echoing on the tile floor as he approached Jack's holding cell. 2 military police officers flanked him, moving with practiced precision. The tension in the air thickened as the general reached the door to the holding area, his presence seemingly magnified by the weight of the menacing SUV still parked outside, securing the perimeter. Jack Lawson had remained calm and unflinching as he sat in the holding room, his hands resting evenly on his knees, his gaze fixed ahead. The officers who had previously surrounded him with suspicion now stood at attention, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. They had no idea that the old man they had seen as just another irrelevant figure was, in fact, someone whose actions had shaped the course of history. When the general stepped into the room, the transformation in the atmosphere was immediate. The air grew heavy with respect, and even the most hardened officers in the room couldn't help but sense the significance of the moment. The general paused for a moment, surveying Jack with a sense of familiarity and respect that was impossible to miss. "Commander Lawson," the general said with authority, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for doubt. "It's been a long time." Jack slowly raised his eyes to meet the general's, his movements smooth and deliberate, as though he had never once faltered. A faint, knowing smile tugged at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. He had seen much in his life, and this, whatever it was merely another chapter in his long and storied journey. "General Carter," Jack said, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't expect you to be the one to come for me. But I suppose you were the right man for the job." The general's eyes softened for a brief moment, the respect between the two men palpable. But that fleeting moment of camaraderie disappeared quickly, replaced by the urgency of the mission at hand. "I came because it's time, Jack," General Carter said. "The protocol you've been waiting for has been activated. It's time to return what you've been carrying all these years." As the general spoke, the officers around them remained silent, watching as the two men shared a quiet understanding that no one else in the room could comprehend. To them, Jack had been nothing more than an old man with an eccentric past. But to General Carter, he was a brother in arms, someone who had carried a burden of honor for far longer than anyone could imagine. Jack nodded slowly, his expression serious. "I've kept my promise. I haven't forgotten them. Not for a single day." The general glanced toward the wooden box sitting on the table, its contents still concealed from the eyes of those who didn't understand. "I know, Jack. And we're here to make sure they're remembered. But there are things you need to know. Things that go beyond just this box. Things that only you can help us with now." As the officers stood by, silently observing the exchange, the reality of what had just unfolded hit them. This wasn't just about a box or a mission, it was about something far more profound, something that would require every ounce of their training, their understanding, and their respect. They weren't just dealing with an old man who had lived through history. They were dealing with a living, breathing piece of history itself. General Carter turned back to Captain Reynolds, his tone shifting to one of professionalism. "Captain, we need to get Commander Lawson to secure facilities. You've done your part, but from here on, we handle things our way. Please ensure that everything in this station is accounted for and locked down. No one leaves until we say so." Reynolds nodded, the reality of her new role sinking in. "Understood, sir. I'll ensure the station is secure." With that, the general motioned for Jack to stand. As Jack rose from his seat, the officers around him instinctively stepped back, offering him space, a quiet respect settling in their eyes. The old man who had once seemed insignificant had now become the focal point of something much larger than themselves. What they didn't know was that Jack Lawson, commander of Echo Alpha Unit, was about to take them all on a journey that would change the course of history. And so, as Jack Lawson and General Carter walked side by side out of the holding room, the doors of the precinct seemed to close not just on the building but on a chapter of the past that had remained hidden for far too long. The future, it seemed, was about to be rewritten, and Jack Lawson was the key to unlocking it. Jack's mission and the final acknowledgement. As Jack Lawson stood, a slight creak echoing in the otherwise quiet room, the weight of decades of secrecy seemed to hang around him. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if every step he took carried the burden of his past, each footfall a reminder of a promise made long ago. The officers around him, now standing at attention, watched with a mixture of awe and disbelief. This man, this quiet, solitary figure they had once viewed as a mere relic of the past, was someone much more profound, someone whose life had been steeped in history, a history that had remained hidden in the shadows for nearly 50 years. General Carter's voice broke the silence as he motioned toward the door. "Let's go, Jack." The time has come to finish this. His words were heavy with respect, but also with an unspoken urgency. The task at hand was no longer about Jack's arrest. It was about completing a mission that had been left unfinished, a mission that would finally honor the fallen soldiers of Echo Alpha Unit. The wooden box, still carefully placed on the evidence table, contained the insignia that had remained hidden for decades. It was not just a symbol of military rank, it was the key to unlocking a truth buried deep within the shadows of history, an event that, until now, had been kept secret by the government. The mission to retrieve the unit's fallen comrades' names had been a long and painful one. And Jack had promised their families, all those years ago, that he would ensure their sacrifices were not forgotten. As Jack walked out of the precinct, his eyes never wavered. The air was thick with anticipation. The military SUVs that had arrived earlier now seemed almost like sentinels, standing guard as they prepared to escort Jack to his next destination. But there was no fanfare, no parade. Jack was not a man who sought recognition or glory. For him, the mission was always about something deeper: honor, loyalty, and the unspoken duty to those who had been lost in the line of service. The general and his team walked beside him, a quiet procession as the weight of Jack's past caught up with him. For the first time, Jack felt a sense of finality. The pieces of the puzzle he had carried with him for so long were finally falling into place. The promise he had made to his fallen comrades was now within reach, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. When they reached the military convoy outside, the personnel moved quickly to form a secure perimeter, ensuring that nothing could interrupt their departure. Jack climbed into the passenger seat of one of the SUVs, his hands resting calmly in his lap as he looked out the window. He could see the station in his rearview mirror, the precinct that had once represented the ordinary, now transformed into something much more extraordinary. It had served its purpose in the larger story, just as he had. As they drove through the streets, Jack could feel the eyes of the town upon him. He had lived in this small, quiet place for years, always a figure of respect but never one to attract attention. Yet tonight, the world had shifted. What was once a routine existence had now become a part of something much larger, a story of honor, sacrifice, and the fulfillment of a promise that had lasted almost 5 decades. The journey to Andrews Air Force Base was long, and Jack could feel the weight of it all pressing on him, but he didn't show it. He had made peace with this part of his life long ago. There was no need for words. His actions would speak for him now. And as they approached the gates of the base, Jack knew that the final piece of the mission was close to completion. He had come full circle. At the base, a ceremony was being prepared to honor Jack and his unit, a long overdue recognition for a group of men who had given their lives in service. The base, a place that represented the highest honor in the military, would now be the stage for the acknowledgement Jack had waited so long for. He would finally stand in the light, not for himself, but for those he had lost. As Jack stood before the audience, the President of the United States beside him, the names of the fallen soldiers of Echo Alpha Unit were read aloud. For each name, a family member stepped forward to accept the recognition. And then, Jack, with his stoic, quiet dignity, was honored not just for his bravery, but for the promise he had kept. The military insignia, once hidden in the old wooden box, was now displayed for all to see. It wasn't just a piece of history. It was a testament to the sacrifices of those who had served in silence, to the brotherhood formed in the heat of battle, and to the unbreakable bond of honor that had held Jack Lawson to his mission for nearly 5 decades. As the ceremony came to a close, Jack stood silently, his back straight and shoulders squared. He had carried the burden of this mission for far too long. And now, it was complete. But as he turned to leave, Jack made one request. "I'll drive myself back," he said softly to General Carter. "The truck has carried me this far. It should finish the journey." The general, understanding the quiet strength behind Jack's words, nodded. "Of course, Jack." And so, the old Chevy pickup, now a symbol of service, sacrifice, and honor, was driven back through the streets. As it passed through the town, people gathered on overpasses and along the road, waving flags and holding signs, showing respect for a hero they had only just come to understand. Back at the station, where it all began, the officers who had once detained Jack now stood at attention, their eyes full of respect as the old truck passed by. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a living memory of all that Jack had done, and all that he had carried for so long. Jack Lawson had completed his mission. He had returned the insignia, fulfilled his promise, and honored the men who had fallen alongside him. And as he drove home, the world had finally come to understand the true meaning of honor, one that resided not in medals, but in the quiet actions of a man who had kept his word, no matter the cost. A hero's journey home. As Jack Lawson's old 1962 Chevy truck rumbled through the streets of his small Texas town, the air felt different, charged with a sense of respect and reverence that had never been there before. The once ignored, battle-worn vehicle now carried a weight far beyond its rusted frame. It had become a symbol, not just of Jack's solitary life, but of decades of service, sacrifice, and honor, something no one had fully understood until now. Outside the precinct, Jack had requested something simple but meaningful. He would drive himself home. The truck had carried him through the hardest of times, and it seemed fitting that it should complete this journey too. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the life he had lived, the promise he had kept, and the long road he had traveled. The military convoy that had followed him to Andrews Air Force Base now trailed behind him, but the vehicle he trusted most, the one that had been with him for all those years, was the one in which he sat alone. As he drove, his thoughts were surprisingly clear. He had waited nearly 50 years for this moment, a moment that he hadn't truly believed would come until it finally did. The insignia, the letter, the mission, all of it had led him here, to this quiet journey through a town that was no longer just the place he had lived, but the place that had borne witness to his final act of duty. On the overpasses and along the roadside, people had gathered, having heard about the ceremony, the story that had been shared on the news. Flags waved, and some even held signs that read, "Thank you, Jack Lawson, true hero," and "Welcome home." These simple gestures, small in comparison to the magnitude of what Jack had done, were enough to make him feel, for the first time, the recognition he had long refused to seek. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as they waved at his truck. The once mocked war wagon now seemed to gleam in the afternoon sunlight, its dents and scars a testament to the battles it had witnessed, both literal and metaphorical. Jack's grip on the steering wheel remained steady, but his heart stirred with an unfamiliar feeling, a mix of pride and sadness, of relief and grief. The fallen soldiers of Echo Alpha Unit were now honored, their names read aloud in the ceremony. But for Jack, the true weight of their sacrifice had never been just in the names. It was in the quiet moments he spent alone with their memory, in the promise he made to them that he would never let them be forgotten. When Jack passed the checkpoint, where the officers had once detained him, they stood at attention, paying their respects as the truck rumbled by. The children who had once laughed at the sight of the old war truck now watched it in reverence, their eyes wide with understanding. What had once seemed like a mere piece of junk had transformed into something far greater. It had become the vehicle of a man who had dedicated his life to something larger than himself, someone who had kept promises when no one was watching. Jack didn't need to look at the officers. He knew they were there, and he knew that, just like everyone else in the town, they now understood. The quiet dignity he had carried all these years had earned them their respect, and that was enough for him. As the truck made its way toward the outskirts of town, Jack's house came into view, the small, unassuming place where he had spent so many years in solitude. He hadn't asked for more than what he had. But as he turned onto the dirt road leading to his home, he saw something he hadn't expected. The families of the men who had fallen with him during the Echo Alpha mission were there, gathered quietly in the yard. They had come, not for a public ceremony, but for something much more personal. They had come to remember, and to share their memories with the man who had never forgotten them. When Jack stepped out of the truck, his legs slightly stiff from the long drive, the families approached him. One by one, they came forward with photographs, letters, and stories of the men who had fallen. They spoke of their loved ones, of the sacrifices they made, of the moments they had shared before they went to war. Each family member held a piece of the past that Jack had carried with him all these years. In return, Jack shared his memories of the men, the stories of their bravery, their strength, and their courage. There were no grand speeches, no public applause. What took place in that small yard was something more intimate, a living memorial to those who had been lost, and to the man who had spent nearly half a century ensuring they were not forgotten. It was a quiet gathering, but it was enough. In the months that followed, life in Jack's town returned to its usual rhythm. But Jack was different now. He carried a quiet peace with him, knowing that the promise he had kept was no longer just a personal commitment. It was a promise honored by all who had come to understand the true meaning of duty and sacrifice. The old Chevy pickup, which had once seemed like an afterthought, had earned its place in history. The military had made it clear. It was no longer just Jack's vehicle, but a symbol of the men he had fought alongside and the promise that had kept him going for all these years. The brass plaque that had been installed on the dashboard, reading, "Walter Lawson, Keeper of Promises for 47 years," served as a reminder to anyone who saw it. Jack, in his quiet way, had completed his final mission. He had returned the insignia, honored the fallen, and fulfilled a promise made decades ago. And as he sat in his truck one last time, driving alone down the same quiet road he had driven for so many years, he finally understood that some missions don't need recognition. Some things are simply done because they are the right thing to do, whether anyone is watching or not. For Jack Lawson, the road ahead was clear. He had kept his word. And that was enough. The final reflection. The days following Jack Lawson's return to his small rural home were quiet, almost peaceful. The town had started to settle back into its usual routine, but something had shifted. The once mundane landscape of Jack's life, the simple trips to town, the quiet hours spent alone, was now underscored by something deeper. The weight of history had come into his life in ways he hadn't anticipated, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a shift within himself. Though Jack had never craved recognition, the ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base, the family's visits to his home, and the gratitude shown by the townspeople had touched something inside him. He wasn't the same man who had driven that old, worn truck into the precinct just days before. That moment, the moment when the world finally acknowledged his life's work, was something Jack had never expected to experience. Yet it had come, not in a burst of celebration, but in a quiet, solemn procession, just as Jack had always lived his life. One afternoon, a young reporter appeared on the dirt road that led up to Jack's house. The reporter had heard of Jack's story, of his years in Echo Alpha Unit, the decades of duty and the final act of honor that had brought him to national attention. She had been following the story from the beginning and had finally managed to catch up with him. When she knocked on Jack's door, he was sitting on his front porch, the old Chevy truck parked nearby. He wasn't one for company, but something about her earnestness made him agree to the interview. "Mr. Lawson," the reporter said softly as she approached him, "can I ask you what it feels like to finally have your story known? The world has finally learned what you've done, what you've sacrificed." Jack took a long moment before responding. His gaze was steady, but his thoughts seemed to linger on something far beyond the reporter's question. His fingers rested lightly on the arms of his chair, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Recognition isn't why good men do difficult things," Jack finally replied, his voice steady. "We do them because they're right. Whether anyone is watching or not." The reporter paused, taking in the weight of his words. There was no bitterness in his voice, no yearning for praise. Jack had never done anything for the accolades, or the headlines. Everything he had done, every step he had taken, had been out of a sense of duty, a promise made to the men he had lost, and to the families who had waited for answers. "And what about the men who didn't come home?" The reporter pressed gently, sensing the depth behind his words. "What does it mean to you that their story has finally been told?" Jack's eyes softened as he thought of them. "They were my brothers," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They should have been remembered a long time ago. But now they are. And that's enough." There was a moment of silence between them, the weight of Jack's words hanging in the air. The reporter knew she was hearing something rare, something real, but she couldn't quite grasp the full depth of it. How could she? She had never carried the weight of decades of unspoken duty and sacrifice. The interview ended without fanfare. Jack returned to his quiet life, as he always had, never seeking more than what he had already given. He had done his part. He had kept the promise that had bound him for nearly 50 years, and now, the burden of that commitment had been lifted. His comrades were remembered. The fallen soldiers of Echo Alpha were no longer forgotten. And though the world would move on, Jack remained exactly the same, a man of quiet dignity, of steadfast resolve, a man who had done what was right, no matter the cost. As the reporter left, she turned back for one final look at the porch where Jack sat, alone with his thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light across the fields. Jack remained still, watching the horizon. In the quiet of that moment, he was at peace. Because, in the end, the quiet actions of a man who kept his words spoke louder than any recognition ever could. Jack Lawson didn't need anyone to understand his sacrifices. He knew the truth. He had fulfilled his duty, and in doing so, had honored not only his fallen brothers but also the life he had lived, a life that would always be defined by the promises he kept, even when no one was watching. A quiet legacy. The weeks after the ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base settled into a peaceful routine for Jack Lawson. The whirlwind of recognition had passed, the media's attention had faded, and the families of the fallen had returned to their lives, knowing their loved ones' sacrifices would finally be remembered. For Jack, however, life remained much the same as it had always been. His quiet, rural home on the edge of town was where he found solace, where he could reflect in solitude. Despite the national attention his story had garnered, Jack had never sought the spotlight. He had never desired a life of fame or accolades. To him, true honor was found in the quiet moments, the promises made and kept, the duty fulfilled. And now, after nearly 50 years, the weight of his promise had been lifted, the truth about Echo Alpha Unit and its fallen soldiers finally known to the world. Yet, as the days passed, there were moments when Jack would sit on his porch, looking at the old Chevy truck that had carried him through it all. The truck had become more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of his life, of the enduring strength of a man who had faced impossible odds and kept his word, no matter the cost. But as much as he cherished the old truck, it was the memories of the men he had served with that weighed most heavily on his heart. Every so often, Jack would receive a letter, a simple card, or a photo from the families of the men he had lost in Vietnam. They wrote to thank him for bringing their loved ones' stories to light, for honoring their memories, for keeping the promise that had been made all those years ago. These letters, though few and far between, meant more to Jack than any medal or ceremony ever could. They were a reminder that his efforts had truly made a difference, that the legacy of his fallen brothers had been carried forward and would never be forgotten. On one such afternoon, as Jack sat in the shade of an old oak tree, he heard the familiar hum of the truck approaching. He turned to see a few of the town's residents coming toward his house. They were the same people who had once waved at him from across the street, who had passed him by without a second thought. But now, things were different. They had all come to pay their respects, to thank him for his service, and to honor the quiet strength he had always embodied. They didn't come with fanfare or speeches. Instead, they came with small gestures, a handshake, a quiet nod, a hand on his shoulder. To Jack, these simple moments meant more than any public recognition. It was a way of showing that, even in his small corner of the world, his life had mattered, his sacrifices had not been in vain. As the years passed, Jack continued his daily routine. He still drove his truck to town for supplies, still lived quietly in his modest home, and still carried the weight of his memories with him. But there was a new sense of peace in his life. The promise he had kept for so long had been fulfilled. His brothers' names had been remembered, their stories shared, and their sacrifices honored. The truck, though old and worn, remained a constant presence in Jack's life. It was more than just a reminder of his past. It was a symbol of endurance, of a life well lived, and of a man who had fulfilled his duty without ever asking for anything in return. And though Jack never said it aloud, he knew that he had done something few could ever achieve. He had kept his promise, and that was the legacy he left behind. In the end, Jack Lawson was not defined by the medals he never sought, the recognition he never desired, or the headlines that came too late. He was defined by the quiet, steadfast determination to do what was right, even when no one was watching. And that, more than anything, was the legacy that would endure long after the world had moved on. The return to quiet. As Jack Lawson sat in his familiar chair, the sun setting on his quiet home, he realized that, after all the events of the past months, things had returned to the simplicity he had always known. The grand ceremony, the media attention, the family's gratitude, it had all been necessary, but it had also been fleeting. Jack had never sought any of it. He had spent decades in the shadows, carrying a promise to his fallen comrades, and now that the promise had been fulfilled, the world had turned its gaze away. But for Jack, that didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done what he set out to do. The names of those who had fallen with him in the Echo Alpha unit were no longer lost to time. Their stories had been told, their sacrifices acknowledged, and their families had finally received the recognition they deserved. And with that, Jack could finally rest, knowing that he had honored their memory as he had promised. The days after the ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base had felt like a return to normal, but there was a quiet shift within Jack. He had been a part of something monumental, something that would echo long after he was gone. Yet as he sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, Jack felt a peace he hadn't known in years. His mission was complete. His duty had been fulfilled. The old Chevy truck, still parked in the yard, had become a symbol of his journey. It was more than just the vehicle that had carried him through so many years. It was a reminder of the long road he had traveled, the hardships he had endured, and the promise he had kept. Its rusted exterior, the chipped paint, the worn-out seats, everything about it spoke to the resilience of a man who had never faltered, no matter the odds. As the days passed, Jack received fewer visits. The town had begun to move on, as towns often do, and the families who had honored him with their gratitude now lived their own lives, knowing their loved ones' memories would never be forgotten. Jack didn't mind the solitude. He had always preferred it. His life, after all, had been one of quiet service, and he didn't need the world to acknowledge him to find peace. One evening, as he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, a car pulled up, an old neighbor he hadn't seen in years. The man stepped out, his face weathered by time, but with a smile that spoke of friendship and respect. "Jack," the neighbor said, tipping his hat. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything." Jack gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me. I did what I had to do." The neighbor sat down beside him, the two men silent for a while, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Jack's neighbor was a man of few words, and they didn't need to speak much. The silence between them was comfortable, like an unspoken understanding. They didn't need grand gestures or speeches. They simply knew. As they sat there, Jack realized that this was how it was meant to be. No grand acknowledgement, no sweeping recognition, just quiet moments like these, with people who understood, who respected, and who knew that some things were just meant to be done, without fanfare, without applause. The days turned into months, and Jack's life continued in its quiet, unassuming way. The occasional visit from an old friend or family member, the routine trips into town for supplies, life had returned to the pace it had always had. Jack was content. His mission was over. He had kept his promise, and in doing so, had ensured that those who had fallen were remembered. And as he sat on his porch, watching the sun set on another quiet evening, Jack Lawson knew that, in the end, it was not the recognition or the ceremony that mattered most. It was the peace that comes with knowing you've done what was right. And that, he thought with a small, satisfied smile, was enough. Jack Lawson had fulfilled his duty. And now, he could finally rest. The unspoken truth. Months had passed since the grand ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base, and the town had moved on, as it always did. The world outside Jack Lawson's quiet existence had returned to its usual rhythm, the story of the Echo Alpha unit's sacrifice fading from the headlines. Yet, Jack's life had remained untouched by the storm of attention. He had lived through a brief moment of recognition, but for him, the honor had always been in the quiet, steady persistence of his actions, never in the applause or the cameras. The old Chevy truck, which had once carried him through countless moments of solitude, still sat in the yard, its worn exterior bearing the marks of a lifetime of service. To Jack, it was more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of his unwavering commitment, a reminder of the men he had served alongside, the men he had lost, and the promise he had kept to them for nearly 50 years. Though Jack had kept to his routine, there were still moments that made him pause. Every so often, as he walked past the truck or sat quietly on his porch, he would think about the men who hadn't come home. He thought of them often, their faces lingering in his memory as if they had never truly left. They were the ones who had never had the chance to fulfill their own promises. But Jack had done it for them. He had kept their legacy alive, and that was what mattered most. One afternoon, Jack was walking back from the town store, his hands carrying a small bag of groceries. As he reached the gate to his property, he saw a familiar face standing by the fence. It was an old friend, one who had been around during his younger days, someone who had always known Jack but had never fully understood the depth of his past. "Jack, it's good to see you, old friend," the man said, his voice warm but tinged with something more, something unspoken. He had come to pay his respects, but there was more in his eyes than just gratitude. "Same to you, Tom," Jack replied, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years spent in silence. He knew what this conversation was about before it even began. Tom cleared his throat, his gaze drifting to the old truck that sat in the yard, its dents and scars like battle marks etched into the vehicle. "You know, Jack," he began slowly, "there's something I've been thinking about. You never told anyone what you really did you?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the truck, remembering the days when it had carried him through some of the hardest moments of his life. He could still feel the weight of those promises, those losses, those men who had depended on him. "No," Jack said after a moment, his voice low. "I didn't." Tom let out a sigh, his hands on the fence as he stared at Jack with a mixture of respect and something else, something deeper. "I don't think anyone truly understood. Not until now. Not until we learned the truth about what you did all those years ago." Jack's eyes met his old friend's, a quiet understanding passing between them. He knew that Tom had always respected him, but the truth had remained hidden for so long that even those closest to him had never understood the full weight of what Jack had carried. The story of the Echo Alpha unit, of the sacrifices made, of the promises kept, had been buried with Jack for far too long. But now it was known. "You don't have to say anything, Jack," Tom continued, his voice thick with emotion. "We know. We all know now. And we're grateful. For what you did. For what you've carried all these years." Jack nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. There were no grand words to add, no speeches to give. In the quiet of the moment, the truth was simple. Jack had done what was right. He had kept his promise, and that was all that mattered. The weight of the past, the burden of duty, had been acknowledged, and in doing so, it had been set down. "You don't need to thank me, Tom," Jack said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. They deserve to be remembered. That's all." Tom stood there for a moment, his eyes reflecting the same quiet respect that Jack had always carried within him. Then, without another word, he reached out and shook Jack's hand, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding, and of final closure. As Tom walked away, Jack stood by the gate for a while longer, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and purple. The weight of the years was still there, but it was lighter now. The truth had come to light, the promise had been kept, and the world had finally understood what Jack had done. The silence that followed was not one of loneliness, but of peace. Jack had fulfilled his mission. And in the quiet of his home, Surrounded by the memories of the men he had lost, and the promises he had kept, Jack Lawson finally found the rest he had earned so long ago.